The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the pre-dawn darkness of the operations center, 12 sets of eyes stared at the frequency display showing nothing but dead air. Lieutenant Commander Valentina Vortex Kozlov stood motionless behind the tactical planning table, her weathered hands resting on charts that had been dismissed as academic fantasy just 6 hours earlier. The SEAL team leader, whose confidence had bordered on arrogance during the mission briefing, now pressed his earpiece deeper, desperate for any transmission from his men. "Bravo 6, come in," he repeated, his voice betraying the first crack of uncertainty. "Bravo 6, radio check." The silence stretched like a held breath. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan, 8 of America's most elite warriors had vanished into the kind of tactical nightmare that Kozlov had predicted with unsettling precision. Her plan, dismissed as overly cautious, too complex, helicopter pilot thinking, had outlined every ambush point, every radio dead zone, every escape route that conventional ground tactics would miss. The SEAL commander had literally laughed when she'd suggested aerial overwatch at specific coordinates. "Ma'am," whispered Staff Sergeant Torres, the intelligence analyst who'd been the only voice supporting Kozlov's assessment, "the last GPS ping was at grid reference." "November 77 Tango 45, Kozlov finished quietly, not looking at the map. She'd memorized every coordinate in her rejected plan. "Approximately 12 clicks northeast of the insertion point, in the valley I marked as Killbox Charlie." The SEAL commander's jaw tightened. 3 months ago, Kozlov had been flying medical evacuations and supply runs, dismissed by ground units as just another bus driver in a Black Hawk. Her tactical assessments were tolerated but rarely taken seriously, despite her background in Air Force Special Operations before transferring to Army Aviation. She was competent, they'd acknowledged, but lacked the ground combat experience that mattered in counterinsurgency operations. Now, as the clock ticked past 4:30 hours and still no word from the team, her warnings echoed with prophetic weight. The enemy had adapted. They were monitoring American radio frequencies, learning patrol patterns, setting sophisticated traps in terrain that looked deceptively simple from satellite imagery. Kozlov's plan had accounted for this evolution in insurgent tactics. The traditional SEAL approach had not. Outside, the rotors of her modified A-60M sat still in the mountain air, waiting. She'd requested permission for immediate search and rescue 3 times. 3 times denied. "Too risky," they said. "Wait for daylight," they said. "Standard protocol," they said. But protocols were written for predictable enemies, and this enemy had just demonstrated they knew exactly where American Special Operations Forces were operating. The question was no longer whether Kozlov's plan had been right. The question was whether 8 Green Berets were still alive to benefit from that knowledge. The first hint came at 4:47 hours, not from the missing team, but from an intercepted enemy transmission. The voice spoke in accented English, reading coordinates that made every person in the operations center freeze. They were Kozlov's coordinates, the exact overwatch positions and escape routes from her rejected plan. Somehow, the enemy had obtained not just American radio frequencies, but American tactical intelligence. Staff Sergeant Torres looked up from his monitoring station, face pale. "Commander, they're broadcasting our classified grid references, the ones from Lieutenant Commander Kozlov's brief." The SEAL commander, whose nameplate read MORRASON, slowly turned toward Kozlov. For the first time since she'd arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman, he looked at her not as a helicopter pilot who occasionally offered opinions, but as someone who might understand something he didn't. "How?" Morrison's voice was steady, but his confidence had evaporated. "How did they get those coordinates? Those were never transmitted in the clear." Kozlov studied the terrain map, her finger tracing elevation lines and ridgelines with the precision of someone who'd spent countless hours studying this exact area from above. Her flight helmet sat nearby, adorned with patches that told a story most ground units never bothered to read. Air Force Combat Action Medal, Army Aviation Badge, and a small, faded insignia from her days with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. "Because they've been watching us," she said quietly, "not just monitoring our radios, watching our patterns, our insertion points, our extraction zones. They've mapped our entire operational footprint." She pointed to a cluster of compounds on the satellite imagery. "These villages aren't just housing civilians, they're observation posts." Morrison stepped closer to the table. "You're saying they've been conducting surveillance on our surveillance?" "For months." Kozlov's voice carried the weight of someone who tried to warn colleagues who wouldn't listen. "Every time we inserted a team using standard approaches, they noted our methods. Every time we extracted from predictable landing zones, they recorded our timing. Your team walked into the culmination of an intelligence operation that's been building since last spring." The intercepted radio chatter continued, now including tactical call signs that belonged to the missing SEAL team. The enemy wasn't just monitoring American communications. They were actively using captured intelligence to coordinate their own operations. The hunters had become the hunted, and the transition had happened so gradually that conventional military thinking had failed to recognize it. Torres adjusted his headset, filtering through multiple frequencies. "Ma'am, I'm picking up movement reports from multiple enemy positions. They're talking about packages being moved to secondary locations." Kozlov's expression darkened. Packages, military euphemism for captured personnel. Morrison's tactical experience told him what that meant, but he needed confirmation from someone who understood the bigger picture. "Lieutenant Commander, in your assessment, what's our window?" 6 hours, Kozlov replied without hesitation. "Maybe 8 if they're following the pattern from previous captures in this sector. After that, your men get moved to caves or compounds where we'll never find them without significant collateral damage." The operations center fell silent except for the constant background hum of electronics and the distant sound of generators. Everyone understood the mathematics of special operations rescue: time versus distance versus enemy capability. The equation was shifting against them with every passing minute. Morrison looked at the woman whose plan he'd dismissed, whose tactical assessment had proven accurate, whose understanding of enemy adaptation had surpassed his own. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the operations center, Kozlov's face showed the kind of weathered confidence that came from years of flying in hostile territory. This wasn't theoretical for her. She'd extracted compromised teams before. "What do you need?" Morrison asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. For months, Kozlov had been providing intelligence and tactical support while being treated as auxiliary personnel. Now, suddenly, she was being asked to take operational lead in the most critical rescue mission the base had seen. "Full operational authority," she said. "No overrides, no second-guessing, no standard protocol exceptions. And I need your remaining team members to trust someone they've never worked with." Morrison glanced around the operations center. His superior officers were either asleep or unreachable. His men were compromised. Traditional extraction methods had failed before they'd even been attempted. The enemy had demonstrated tactical sophistication that conventional approaches couldn't counter. He looked back at Kozlov. "Done." The transformation was immediate. Kozlov moved to the communications array with the fluid efficiency of someone shifting from advisory to command mode. Her voice, when she began issuing orders, carried an authority that made veteran special operations personnel snap to attention without question. "Torres, I need real-time signals intelligence on all enemy frequencies in a 15-kilometer radius. Map their communication patterns and identify their command structure. Martinez," she called to the air operations specialist, "prep my bird for immediate launch. Full fuel, extended range configuration, and load the port side with the rescue hoist. Williams, coordinate with intelligence. I need updated imagery on every structure within 12 clicks of the last known position." Her hands moved across the tactical display with practiced precision, marking routes and positions that deviated completely from standard operating procedures. Instead of direct approaches to the last known enemy contact, she plotted a flight path that would take her deep into valleys that conventional wisdom considered too dangerous for single aircraft operations. Morrison watched her work, recognizing something he'd missed before. This wasn't just a helicopter pilot offering suggestions. This was someone who developed an entirely different tactical philosophy based on years of operating in terrain where traditional methods failed. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said quietly, "what aren't you telling us about your background?" Kozlov paused in her planning, her fingers still resting on the map coordinates. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there during the earlier briefings, not confidence, but the kind of calm that came from having operated in situations where failure meant death. "Pilot Officer Valentina Kozlov, formerly of the 160th SOAR," she said. 3 years flying special insertion missions in Iraq, 2 years supporting British SAS operations in Syria, 18 months with Joint Task Forces in Somalia. She returned to the map. "I didn't transfer to regular Army aviation by choice, Commander. I was reassigned after questioning operational methods that were getting aircrews killed." The operations center had grown quiet. Everyone was listening now. "I developed what my former commanders called unorthodox tactical approaches," Kozlov continued. "Methods that prioritized enemy intelligence over American firepower. Techniques that assumed our opponents were learning faster than we were adapting. I was right, but being right in the military sometimes makes you more dangerous than being wrong." Morrison understood. He'd seen it before, competent personnel reassigned not for failure, but for challenging institutional thinking. The military's greatest strength, its adherence to proven methods, could also be its greatest weakness when facing adaptive enemies. "The coordinates they're broadcasting," Morrison said, "those aren't just from your plan, they're from operational experience." "Somalia," Kozlov confirmed. "Similar terrain, similar enemy adaptation patterns. The coordinates I gave you weren't theoretical. They were based on positions where I'd successfully extracted compromised teams when conventional approaches failed." Torres looked up from his monitoring station. "Ma'am, I'm reading increased radio traffic from multiple enemy positions. They're coordinating something." Kozlov checked her watch. 5:23 hours. "They're moving the packages. We have 4 hours before this becomes a recovery mission instead of a rescue." She moved toward the operations center exit, then paused. "Commander Morrison, your team followed standard protocols because that's what made them elite. But elite tactics become predictable tactics when your enemy has time to study them. What made me elite was being unpredictable enough to extract elite teams when predictable methods failed." Morrison nodded slowly. "Vortex." "Sorry." "Your call sign. I never asked why Vortex." For the first time since the crisis began, Kozlov almost smiled. "Because conventional aircraft follow predictable flight paths, but a vortex moves in patterns that seem chaotic until you understand the underlying physics. The enemy can predict where a helicopter will fly. They can't predict where a vortex will go." She walked toward the flight line, leaving Morrison and his remaining team members to contemplate the difference between following proven methods and adapting to an enemy that had learned to counter proven methods. Outside, the U-60M Blackhawk sat silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, its rotors still but ready. Kozlov approached her aircraft with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed these checks hundreds of times in hostile territory. This wasn't just a helicopter to her. It was a weapons system that she'd modified and adapted based on years of experience that her current colleagues had never fully understood. The aircraft bore subtle differences from standard configurations: extended fuel tanks for longer range operations, modified communication arrays for intercepting enemy transmissions, upgraded defensive systems that reflected lessons learned from operations that weren't in any official manual. Most importantly, it was equipped with navigation systems that could operate effectively in terrain where GPS signals were unreliable and traditional waypoints became death traps. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the crew chief, approached with the pre-flight checklist. "Ma'am, aircraft is configured for single-pilot operation with rescue capability. Fuel load sufficient for 4 hours operational time, plus reserves. Defensive systems active and tested. Communications. Full spectrum monitoring and transmission capability. We've loaded the enemy frequency database from intelligence. You'll be able to monitor their coordination in real time." Kozlov nodded, running her hands along the aircraft's fuselage with the familiarity of someone who'd trusted her life to this machine countless times. "Martinez, this operation may not follow standard procedures. If ground control issues orders that contradict my tactical decisions, what's your position?" The crew chief looked directly at her. "Ma'am, I've seen the intelligence reports. I know your background. If you're flying, I'm following your lead." It was a statement that carried significant weight. Crew chiefs in Special Operations Aviation were selected for their ability to make independent judgments about risk and mission effectiveness. Martinez's confidence represented validation from someone whose opinion carried substantial credibility. Kozlov climbed into the pilot's seat, her movements efficient and practiced. The pre-flight checks were completed in half the time normally required, not because she was rushing, but because she'd performed them so many times that her hands moved automatically while her mind focused on tactical planning. The radio crackled. "Vortex, this is base operations. You are cleared for immediate departure on search and rescue mission. Flight plan filed, weather conditions acceptable, enemy threat level assessed as moderate." Kozlov keyed her microphone. "Base operations, Vortex. Understand cleared for departure. Be advised, threat level assessment may be inaccurate based on current intelligence. Request permission to deviate from filed flight plan as tactical situation requires." Vortex, base operations. Permission granted for tactical deviations. Commander Morrison has authorized full operational discretion. The engine spun up with the distinctive whine of turboshaft power plants reaching operational speed. Kozlov felt the familiar vibration as the rotor system engaged, the aircraft transforming from static machine to dynamic weapon. This was where her years of experience converged, not just flying, but tactical flying in hostile territory against enemies who'd learned to predict and counter American aviation tactics. "Vortex departing base operations for search and rescue," she transmitted. "Estimated time to operational area 47 minutes. Will maintain radio contact on command frequency." The US-60M lifted from the flight line with the smooth efficiency of a pilot who understood exactly how much the aircraft could do and where its limitations began. Instead of following the direct route that appeared on her filed flight plan, Kozlov immediately deviated to a heading that would take her through valleys and ridgelines that provided natural concealment from ground observation. This was the essence of what she tried to explain to Morrison's team during the planning briefing. The enemy had learned to predict American helicopter operations by studying their patterns. Direct routes, predictable altitudes, standard approach procedures. All of these had become tactical vulnerabilities when facing opponents who'd had months to analyze American methods. As the base disappeared behind her, Kozlov activated the aircraft's intercept capability and began monitoring enemy radio frequencies. The voices she heard confirmed her assessment. They weren't just conducting military operations. They were conducting intelligence operations designed to exploit American predictability. 37 minutes later, flying through terrain that would have been considered impossible for conventional aviation operations, Kozlov arrived at a position overlooking the valley where Morrison's team had disappeared. What she saw through her aircraft's optics confirmed the tactical nightmare she'd predicted. The enemy hadn't just captured a SEAL team. They'd used the SEAL team's own operational methods to lure them into a sophisticated trap that demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication American forces hadn't encountered before in this theater. More critically, they were already moving the captured Americans to secondary locations, following procedures that suggested they'd planned for exactly this scenario. Kozlov keyed her radio. Base operations, Vortex, have visual contact with operational area. Situation is significantly more complex than initial assessment. Enemy demonstrates advanced tactical coordination and intelligence capability. Captured personnel are being moved to multiple locations using procedures that suggest extensive operational planning. Morrison's voice came through her earpiece. Vortex Base, can you identify captured personnel location? Negative on single location base. Enemy has split the packages and is moving them through separate routes to different destinations. This isn't opportunistic capture. This is a planned intelligence operation designed to exploit our rescue attempts. The silence on the radio suggested that Morrison was beginning to understand the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a tactical problem that required completely different thinking. Base operations, Vortex, requesting permission to implement non-standard extraction procedures. Standard rescue approaches will result in additional casualties and potential loss of aircraft. Vortex Base, describe non-standard procedures. Kozlov looked at the terrain below, calculating vectors and timing based on patterns she'd learned from operations that weren't in any manual. Base, I'm going to make them think they've succeeded, then use their success against them. Morrison's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Elaborate, Vortex. They've planned for American rescue attempts using American methods. They haven't planned for rescue attempts using their own methods. The radio fell silent as Morrison tried to process what Kozlov was suggesting. Finally, Vortex, you're cleared for whatever you think will work. Kozlov smiled grimly and began her descent into the valley, following a flight path that violated every principle of safe helicopter operations, but adhered perfectly to principles of survival in hostile territory that she'd learned the hard way. What happened next would either validate years of tactical development that had been dismissed as unorthodox, or it would result in the loss of a helicopter and pilot in addition to the captured SEAL team. But as Kozlov brought her aircraft into the valley using techniques that seemed to defy both physics and common sense, something interesting began happening on the enemy radio frequencies. The confident coordination that had characterized their earlier transmissions started to show signs of uncertainty. They had planned for American tactics. They hadn't planned for tactics that seemed American but followed logic they didn't recognize. Kozlov's approach to the valley floor used terrain features in ways that confused enemy observers. Instead of following predictable flight corridors, she used wind patterns and natural concealment to approach from directions that observation posts hadn't been established to monitor. Her aircraft appeared and disappeared behind ridgelines in patterns that suggested multiple helicopters, rather than a single aircraft operating in impossible terrain. The enemy radio chatter shifted from confident coordination to confused reporting. They'd prepared for helicopter insertion patterns they understood. They weren't prepared for insertion patterns that violated their understanding of how American aircraft operated. Position 7, this is command. Report helicopter count and approach direction. Command, Position 7. Count uncertain. Aircraft appears to be multiple aircraft or single aircraft operating in non-standard pattern. Cannot determine approach vector. Kozlov listened to the confusion with professional satisfaction. This was exactly what happened when enemy intelligence preparation met tactical unpredictability. They'd studied American methods so thoroughly that they couldn't process American methods that didn't match their intelligence database. She continued her approach, using techniques that had been developed during operations where conventional methods had failed. The key was understanding that enemy observers expected helicopter operations to follow logical patterns, direct routes, predictable altitudes, standard approaches to landing zones. But helicopter operations in hostile territory didn't have to follow logic that enemies understood. They only had to follow physics and the capabilities of the aircraft and pilot. As Kozlov reached the valley floor, she identified the first piece of intelligence that would change everything about this operation. The captured SEAL team hadn't been moved far. They were being held in a compound less than 2 kilometers from their capture point, but the compound was positioned in terrain that made conventional rescue impossible. More importantly, the enemy was using the captured Americans as bait for a larger operation designed to capture American rescue forces. Kozlov had walked into exactly the kind of sophisticated trap that her former commanders had told her was impossible for insurgent forces to coordinate. But the evidence was undeniable. This enemy had evolved beyond what conventional American tactical thinking could predict or counter. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Vortex Base, status report." "Base, Vortex, have located captured personnel. Enemy capability assessment was inadequate. This is a complex intelligence operation designed to capture additional American forces. Recommend immediate revision of threat assessment and operational approach." "Understood, Vortex. What do you need?" Kozlov studied the terrain below, identifying patterns that revealed the full scope of what they were facing. "Base, I need you to trust that what I'm about to do will appear to be exactly what the enemy wants us to do. But I also need you to trust that what appears to be failure will actually be success." Morrison's response was immediate. "Vortex, you have full operational authority. Execute your best judgment." It was exactly what Kozlov needed to hear. She began her final approach to the compound where the SEAL team was being held, following a flight path that would appear to enemy observers to be a standard American rescue attempt using conventional tactics. But appearances, as Kozlov had learned from years of operations in hostile territory, could be the most effective weapons when used by someone who understood the difference between what enemies expected and what enemies feared. The enemy expected American predictability. They feared American unpredictability. Kozlov was about to demonstrate the difference. As her aircraft approached the compound, enemy forces moved into positions they'd obviously prepared in advance. They'd planned this operation meticulously, accounting for American rescue procedures, helicopter capabilities, and tactical responses. Their confidence was evident in their radio communications. They believed they were about to capture an American helicopter and pilot in addition to the SEAL team they already held. But Kozlov wasn't executing an American rescue procedure. She was executing something that appeared to be an American rescue procedure, but was actually based on principles the enemy hadn't studied, because those principles had been dismissed by American military leadership as unorthodox. The difference was about to become clear. Instead of approaching the compound using standard insertion patterns, Kozlov brought her aircraft in following a route that appeared conventional, but actually positioned her in a location where enemy weapons couldn't engage effectively. Instead of following predictable extraction procedures, she used techniques that had been developed during operations where conventional procedures had failed. Most importantly, instead of trying to extract the captured team using methods the enemy had prepared to counter, she created conditions where the enemy's own preparations became tactical vulnerabilities. The enemy had positioned forces to capture an American helicopter using conventional rescue tactics. Those same positions became exposed and vulnerable when faced with tactics that didn't follow conventional patterns. Kozlov's aircraft touched down in the compound for exactly 17 seconds. When it lifted off, it carried not just the captured SEAL team, but intelligence that would fundamentally change American understanding of enemy capabilities in the region. But the most significant change wasn't tactical or strategic. It was personal. Commander Morrison was waiting when Kozlov's aircraft returned to base. As the captured SEAL team disembarked, their faces showed something that went beyond relief or gratitude. They looked at Kozlov with the kind of respect reserved for someone who'd accomplished something they hadn't believed was possible. More importantly, they looked at her as someone whose tactical judgment they would trust without question in future operations. Morrison approached as Kozlov completed her post-flight procedures. "Lieutenant Commander, that was the most unconventional extraction I've ever witnessed. How did you know their preparations wouldn't work against your approach?" Kozlov removed her flight helmet, her expression reflecting the exhaustion that came after high-stress operations in hostile territory. "Because their preparations were based on studying our conventional methods. But Commander, conventional methods become unconventional when you modify them based on understanding why conventional methods fail. The intelligence you recovered," Morrison continued, "it's going to change how we operate in this theater." "It should change how we operate everywhere," Kozlov replied. "This enemy isn't unique. They're adaptive, and adaptation is spreading faster than our institutional learning curve." Morrison nodded slowly. "Lieutenant Commander, I owe you an apology, and more than that, I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to develop training protocols based on your tactical approach? We need to prepare other teams for enemies who have learned to predict our methods." Kozlov looked at the recovered SEAL team, then at Morrison, then at the mountains that had nearly become the site of a tactical disaster. "Commander, I'd be honored, but understand, training people to be unpredictable means training them to think differently about what elite operations actually mean." "Elaborate." "Elite isn't about following advanced procedures perfectly. Elite is about adapting when advanced procedures are no longer effective. The enemy proved that today. They'd studied our elite procedures so thoroughly that our elite procedures had become vulnerabilities." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "So what makes someone truly elite?" Kozlov shouldered her flight gear and began walking toward the operations center. "Understanding that your enemy's respect for your capabilities becomes your enemy's ability to counter your capabilities. True, elite performance means maintaining effectiveness even when your enemy knows exactly how you operate." As they reached the operations center, Morrison stopped. "Vortex." "Sorry." "Why didn't you fight the reassignment when you were transferred from special operations?" Kozlov considered the question. "Because fighting reassignment meant trying to convince people that their successful methods were becoming unsuccessful methods. That's not a fight you win with arguments, Commander. That's a fight you win with results." "And today?" "Today, 8 American warriors went home to their families instead of disappearing into intelligence files. That's the only result that matters." Morrison watched her enter the operations center, recognizing that he'd just witnessed something that went beyond tactical excellence. He'd witnessed the emergence of military thinking that could adapt faster than enemy learning curves. But more than that, he'd witnessed the validation of someone who'd been dismissed for being right too early. In the weeks that followed, Kozlov's tactical approaches were studied, documented, and gradually integrated into special operations training. Her unconventional methods became conventional doctrine. Her predictions about enemy adaptation became the foundation for new training protocols. But the most significant change wasn't institutional. It was personal. Lieutenant Commander Valentina Vortex Kozlov was no longer seen as a helicopter pilot who occasionally offered tactical opinions. She was recognized as someone whose understanding of adaptive warfare had evolved beyond traditional military thinking. And in a world where enemies learned faster than institutions adapted, that recognition had become the difference between success and catastrophe. The enemy had studied American tactics and learned to counter them. But they hadn't studied Kozlov's tactics, because Kozlov's tactics had been dismissed by the same American institutions the enemy had studied. Sometimes, being dismissed by your own side becomes your most effective weapon against an enemy who's learned to predict your side's methods. Vortex had proven that unconventional thinking wasn't just tactically effective, it was strategically essential. The war continued, but the rules had changed. And for the first time in months, the Americans were changing the rules faster than their enemies could adapt to them. Because true elite performance, as Kozlov had demonstrated, wasn't about perfecting predictable methods. It was about remaining effective when predictable methods were no longer sufficient. The sky above Afghanistan remained hostile territory. But for American forces operating under new tactical doctrines, developed by someone who'd been told her thinking was too unorthodox, that hostile territory had become manageable in ways their enemies hadn't anticipated. And in special operations, the difference between manageable and unmanageable was often the difference between mission success and strategic failure. Kozlov had proven that adaptation wasn't just about learning new techniques. It was about developing new ways of thinking that could evolve faster than enemy countermeasures. 6 months later, when enemy forces attempted to use the same intelligence-gathering methods that had nearly destroyed Morrison's team, they discovered that American tactics had evolved beyond what their intelligence preparation could predict or counter. The hunters had become the hunted again, but this time, the reversal was based on principles that could adapt as quickly as enemy learning curves. Vortex had demonstrated that the most dangerous American forces weren't those who followed elite procedures perfectly. They were those who could maintain elite effectiveness, even when elite procedures were no longer unpredictable. In a world where warfare was becoming an intelligence competition as much as a military competition, that distinction had become strategically decisive. The legacy wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical, understanding that military excellence wasn't about perfecting methods, but about maintaining effectiveness when methods were no longer perfect. And that understanding, developed by someone who'd been reassigned for thinking differently, had become the foundation for a new generation of military thinking that could evolve as quickly as the threats it was designed to counter. The war in Afghanistan eventually ended, but the principles Kozlov had developed continued to influence military operations around the world. Her tactical approaches became doctrine, her training methods became standard, and her understanding of adaptive warfare became foundational to how modern military forces approached evolving threats. But perhaps the most important legacy was personal. The recognition that military effectiveness wasn't about following proven methods, but about developing methods that remained effective even when enemies learned to predict proven methods. Lieutenant Commander Valentina Vortex Kozlov had demonstrated that true military excellence meant remaining excellent even when excellence itself became predictable. And in a world where predictability had become vulnerability, that demonstration had become the difference between tactical success and strategic obsolescence. The sky remained hostile, but American forces flying through that hostile sky now operated according to principles that could adapt as quickly as the hostility itself. That was Kozlov's gift to American military aviation, not just new tactics, but new ways of thinking about tactics that could evolve faster than enemy efforts to counter them. And evolution, as she'd proven, was the ultimate military advantage.